The summer of 1789 clung to Charleston like a funeral shroud, humid, suffocating, and impossible to shake. In the Low Country, where the Ashley and Cooper rivers met the Atlantic, the air tasted of salt, indigo, and something darker that no one dared name. The war had been over for 6 years, but its ghost still walked the cobblestone streets, haunting the widows who had survived it. Margaret Langdon's body was discovered on a Tuesday morning in late August, sprawled across the polished floorboards of her study at Rosewood Plantation, 17 miles north of Charleston. Her skin was grey as storm clouds, her lips tinged blue, and her fingers clutched a quill that had long since run dry. The physician, Dr. Cornelius Havelock, pronounced it yellow fever without so much as examining the body. No one questioned him. Yellow fever was as common as scripture in the Low Country, and Margaret had been frail for months, but it wasn't the fever that set Charleston society ablaze 3 days later. It was what lay sealed in wax upon her desk, her last will and testament. Attorney Jonathan Pembroke sat in the drawing-room of the Langdon estate, surrounded by Margaret's cousins, distant nephews, and the vultures of Charleston's elite, men in black coats who smelled of tobacco and entitlement. Pembroke was a thin man with wire spectacles and hands that trembled as he broke the seal. He cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and began to read. "Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories. I, Margaret Elizabeth Langdon, being of sound mind and failing body, do hereby bequeath the entirety of my estate, Rosewood Plantation, its lands, livestock and holdings, to Samuel, born of unknown parentage, who has served this house with dignity, kindness, and a mercy I have found nowhere else in this world." The room fell silent. Not the silence of respect, but the silence of a blade drawn in the dark. Pembroke continued, his voice cracking. "He is the only soul who showed me compassion when I was forsaken. Let him inherit what I leave behind, for he earned it not through blood, but through grace." One of the cousins, a ruddy-faced man named Thaddeus Langdon, shot to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the floor. "This is madness. She's left everything to a slave." "A freedman," Pembroke corrected quietly, though his voice carried no conviction. "Margaret manumitted him 2 years ago." "Freedman or not, he's coloured," Thaddeus roared. "She's spit on her family, her name, her station. This will is an abomination." Another man, Josiah Merrick, a planter from Goose Creek, leaned forward, his eyes cold as river stones. "Pembroke, you cannot possibly intend to execute this profanity." Pembroke looked down at the parchment, his hands shaking harder now. "The will is legally sound. Margaret was of sound mind when—" "Sound mind?" Thaddeus slammed his fist on the table. "A white woman of good breeding leaves her fortune to a Negro, and you call that sound?" "She was bewitched, Pembroke, or mad with grief." Pembroke said nothing. He had known Margaret Langdon. He had drawn up her accounts, witnessed her signature on contracts, shared tea in this very room. She had been sharp as a razor until the end, her mind unclouded, her resolve unshakable, but he also knew what acknowledging that truth would mean. Outside, beyond the tall windows draped in black mourning cloth, the fields of rosewood stretched toward the tree line, rows of indigo and rice paddies glittering under the late afternoon sun. And somewhere among those fields, Samuel worked, unaware that his name had just been written into a document that would ignite a war. Samuel had been born on Rosewood Plantation 32 years ago, though he had no memory of his mother and no knowledge of his father. The overseer had named him Samuel because it sounded biblical, and the mistress at the time, Margaret's late mother-in-law, had approved. He grew tall and broad-shouldered, with hands that could split timber or cradle a newborn foal with equal skill. His eyes were dark and steady, and he rarely spoke unless spoken to. When Margaret's husband, Colonel Richard Langdon, died at the Battle of Eutaw Springs in 1781, she inherited Rosewood and its 43 enslaved workers. She was 26 years old, childless and entirely alone. The other planters expected her to remarry quickly or sell the estate. She did neither. Instead, she learned. She studied the account books, walked the fields at dawn, and listened when the workers spoke. She was not kind in the way Scripture preached kindness. She did not pity or condescend. But she was fair, and in a world built on cruelty, fairness felt like revolution. Samuel became her foreman 2 years after the colonel's death. It was an unusual appointment. Most planters would never trust such authority to a slave. But Margaret had seen something in him: intelligence, reliability, and a quiet strength that didn't need to prove itself. He managed the planting schedules, mediated disputes among the workers, and kept the estate running when Margaret's grief threatened to drown her. They spoke often. At first, only about crops and repairs, then about books. Margaret lent him volumes from the colonel's library, knowing full well it was illegal to teach a slave to read. Samuel devoured them in secret by candlelight in the quarters, his finger tracing each word like a prayer. And somewhere in those years, in those stolen conversations under the shadow of the magnolia trees, something shifted. Not love, perhaps, not in the way poets wrote of it, but recognition. Two people seeing each other clearly for the first time, stripped of the roles the world had forced upon them. Margaret manumitted Samuel in 1787, quietly and without ceremony. She filed the papers in Charleston, paid the fees, and handed him the document one evening as the sun set over the river. He stared at it for a long time, his hands trembling. "You're free," she said softly. "You can leave if you wish." He looked up at her, his eyes unreadable. "And go where, Miss Margaret?" She had no answer. He stayed. Now, 3 days after her death, Samuel stood at the edge of the indigo fields, staring toward the main house. He had heard the shouting, seen the carriages arrive and depart. He knew something had happened, something that involved him, though he couldn't yet name it. A figure approached from the house, a young enslaved woman named Dinah who worked in the kitchens. She moved quickly, glancing over her shoulder. "Samuel," she hissed, breathless. "They're coming for you." He frowned. "Who?" "The Langdon cousins, the lawyers, everyone." She grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with fear. "Miss Margaret left you the plantation in her will. They're saying you bewitched her, that you poisoned her mind. They're calling it blasphemy." Samuel's stomach dropped. He stared at Dinah, struggling to comprehend her words. She left me. Everything," Dinah whispered. "And now they want your blood." Before Samuel could respond, the sound of hooves thundered up the drive. 3 riders appeared: Thaddeus Langdon, Josiah Merrick, and a constable from Charleston, his badge glinting in the fading light. Thaddeus dismounted, his face twisted with rage. "There he is, the devil who corrupted my cousin's soul." Samuel didn't run. He stood his ground, his heart pounding, as the 3 men advanced. The constable stepped forward, his hand resting on the pistol at his belt. "Samuel," the constable said carefully, "you're going to need to come with us. There are questions about Mrs. Langdon's death, questions about influence." "I didn't kill her," Samuel said quietly. "Then you won't mind answering questions," Josiah said coldly. Samuel looked back toward the quarters, where faces watched from windows and doorways, people he had lived beside his entire life, people who depended on him, and he realized, with a sick certainty, that no matter what he said, no matter what truth he spoke, the world had already decided his guilt, because Margaret Langdon had committed the one unforgivable sin in the South Carolina Low Country. She had seen him as human, and for that they would bury them both. 20 miles south of Rosewood, at Belmead Plantation, Eleanor Ashford stood on her veranda and watched the smoke rise from Charleston's direction. It was thin and distant, barely visible against the amber sky, but she knew what it meant. News travelled fast in the Low Country, carried on the tongues of merchants, servants, and the wind itself. Margaret was dead, and her will had been read. Eleanor's hands gripped the railing, her knuckles white. She was 41 years old, with iron-grey hair pulled severely back and eyes the colour of winter seas. Her husband, Captain Thomas Ashford, had died at Yorktown, leaving her with 1,200 acres, 62 slaves, and a daughter she barely recognised anymore. She had known Margaret Langdon for 15 years. They had been part of a small, unspoken circle. 4 widows who had survived the war, who had learned to navigate a world that expected them to remarry or fade into irrelevance. They met in secret, in the parlour of whichever plantation felt safest that month, and they spoke of things women were not supposed to speak of: money, power, loneliness, and the men who worked their land. It had started innocently enough. Commiseration, mutual support. But somewhere along the way, the conversations had shifted. They talked about the intelligence they saw in their workers, the humanity the world insisted didn't exist. They spoke of the men who managed their estates, who taught them about crops and weather, who looked at them without the condescension of Charleston's society. And then, one night, Margaret had admitted it. "I think I care for him," she had whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "Samuel, I think I don't know what to call it, but I cannot imagine my life without him." The other 3 widows, Eleanor, Catherine Beaumont, and Lydia Crane, had said nothing. Because they understood. They all understood. Now Eleanor turned from the veranda and walked back into the house, her skirts rustling against the polished floors. Her manservant, a man named Isaiah, stood in the hallway, his expression carefully neutral. "Isaiah," she said quietly, "send word to Catherine and Lydia. Tell them we need to meet. Tonight." Isaiah nodded and disappeared without a word. Eleanor moved to her study and locked the door behind her. From a hidden drawer in her desk, she pulled out a bundle of letters, correspondence between the 4 widows, written in careful, coded language. Letters that spoke of affection, of fear, of boundaries crossed and lines blurred. She fed them one by one into the fireplace and watched them burn. Catherine Beaumont's plantation, Harrow Hill, sat on the edge of the Combahee River, its fields lush with rice paddies that glittered like mirrors in the moonlight. Catherine was the youngest of the 4 widows, only 34, and the most fragile. Her husband had been killed by malaria 3 years after the war, and she had inherited an estate on the brink of collapse. It was her foreman, a man named Caleb, who had saved Harrow Hill. He was brilliant with numbers, with logistics, with the delicate balance of water and soil that rice cultivation demanded. Catherine had come to rely on him for everything. And then, slowly, she had come to rely on him for more than that. She sat now in her bedroom, staring at her reflection in the vanity mirror. Her hands shook as she reached for the ribbon in her hair, untying it slowly. She thought of Margaret, of the will, of the scandal that was surely spreading through Charleston like wildfire. A soft knock came at the door. "Miss Catherine." Caleb's voice, low and careful. She closed her eyes. "Come in." He entered, closing the door quietly behind him. He was a tall man, lean and dark-skinned, with hands scarred from years of labor. He had been on Harrow Hill since he was a boy, sold from a plantation in Virginia when he was 12. "You heard," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." He hesitated. "They're saying terrible things. They'll say worse before this is over." She turned to face him, her eyes glistening. "Caleb, if they come here—" "They won't find anything," he said firmly. "There's nothing to find." But they both knew that was a lie. Catherine stood and crossed the room, stopping just before him. "I should send you away, for your safety." "And go where?" He echoed Samuel's words from miles away, though neither of them knew it. She reached out, her fingers brushing his. Just for a moment, just long enough to feel the warmth of his skin, the steady pulse of his heartbeat. Then she stepped back, her face hardening. "Burn anything that could be used against us. Letters, gifts, anything. Do you understand?" He nodded. "And Caleb?" Her voice cracked. "If they ask you questions, lie. Lie to protect yourself. I won't hold it against you." He looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his eyes. "I've never lied to you, Miss Catherine. I don't intend to start now." He left before she could respond. At Willowmere Plantation, Lydia Crane sat alone in her parlour, a glass of sherry untouched on the table beside her. She was 53, the eldest of the widows, and the most pragmatic. Her husband had been a brutal man, and his death in a skirmish with British raiders had been privately a relief. Her foreman, a man named Josiah, not to be confused with the planter Josiah Merrick, was 60 years old, grey-haired and wise. They had never crossed the line that Margaret had crossed, that Catherine was crossing, but Lydia loved him in her own way, the way one loves a trusted advisor, a confidant, a friend in a world that allowed no such friendships. She had already burned her letters. She had already warned Josiah to stay clear of the main house for the next few weeks. And now she sat, waiting for the storm to break. A carriage arrived at midnight. Eleanor Ashford stepped out, followed by Catherine Beaumont, her face pale and drawn. They gathered in the parlour, the three remaining widows, and spoke in whispers. "Margaret was a fool," Eleanor said bluntly. "We all knew it was dangerous. But to put it in writing—" "She loved him," Catherine said softly. "Can we blame her for that?" "Yes," Eleanor snapped. "Because now we're all at risk, every one of us. They'll start looking, questioning, investigating. And if they find even a whisper of impropriety, then we deny everything," Lydia said calmly. "We distance ourselves from Margaret. We call her mad if we must. We protect ourselves." Catherine flinched. She was our friend. "She was," Lydia agreed. "But she's dead, and we're not. I intend to keep it that way." The three women sat in silence, the weight of betrayal settling over them like ash. Outside, in the slave quarters of 3 separate plantations, 3 men lay awake, staring at the ceiling, and wondered what dawn would bring. The Charleston courthouse stood like a monument to judgment itself. White columns rising toward heaven, marble steps worn smooth by decades of boots, carrying men to verdicts already decided before evidence was heard. On the morning of September 15, 1789, a crowd gathered outside that would have filled 3 churches. Planters in silk waistcoats, merchants smelling of rum and tobacco, women in mourning blacks clutching Bibles like weapons, and slaves standing at the edges, silent witnesses to a spectacle designed to remind them of their place. Samuel was brought in chains. They weren't necessary. He had made no attempt to flee, had offered no resistance when the constable arrived at Rosewood 3 weeks prior. But the chains were theatre, a visual sermon for the crowd. They wanted to see him diminished, to see the man who had dared to accept a white woman's affection reduced to the status they believed he had never left. Judge Mortimer Caldwell presided, a man of 67 with a face like carved granite and eyes that had sentenced more men to the noose than he could count. He was a veteran of the colonial courts, a loyalist who had somehow survived the revolution with his position intact, and he viewed the proceedings with the cold efficiency of a butcher separating meat from bone. "This court," he intoned, his voice filling the chamber, "convenes to address matters most grave. The estate of the late Margaret Elizabeth Langdon and the unnatural provisions contained within her purported final testament." Attorney Pembroke sat at the defense table, looking 10 years older than he had 3 weeks ago. Across from him, the prosecution had assembled an army. Thaddeus Langdon's personal attorney, Silas Whitmore, flanked by 2 assistants and backed by half of Charleston's legal establishment. Whitmore stood, adjusting his coat with theatrical precision. He was a small man with a voice like a church bell, clear, resonant, and impossible to ignore. "Your Honor, gentlemen of this court, good people of Charleston," he began, his gaze sweeping the gallery. "We gather today not merely to contest a will, but to defend the very foundations upon which our society rests. Mrs. Margaret Langdon, may God rest her troubled soul, left her estate to a Negro, a man born in bondage, raised in servitude, and only recently manumitted through means we shall examine closely. He turned, pointing at Samuel. That man, who calls himself Samuel, stands accused of nothing less than the corruption of a Christian woman's mind, of exploiting her loneliness, her vulnerability, her feminine frailty, of using dark arts, whether of persuasion or more sinister origin, to bend her will to his own enrichment. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Pembroke started to rise, but Judge Caldwell raised a hand. Mr. Whitmore, you will restrict your opening to matters of law, not speculation. Of course, Your Honor, Whitmore smiled thinly. The law is quite clear. South Carolina recognizes the right of property owners to dispose of their estates as they see fit, provided they are of sound mind and free from undue influence. We intend to prove that Margaret Langdon was neither. He called his first witness, Dr. Cornelius Havelock, the physician who had pronounced Margaret dead. Havelock took the stand, his jowls quivering as he settled into the chair. He was a man who had built his practice on discretion, on telling Charleston's elite exactly what they wanted to hear. Dr. Havelock, Whitmore began smoothly, you attended Mrs. Langdon in the months before her death. Describe her condition. She was gravely ill, Havelock said, his voice carrying the practiced sympathy of a man who had delivered countless diagnoses. Fever, weakness, confusion. In my professional opinion, she was not in possession of her full faculties. Confusion? Whitmore pressed. Can you elaborate? She spoke irrationally, about equality, about the humanity of her slaves. She claimed they had souls equal to ours. He shook his head sadly. Such notions are not consistent with a sound Christian mind. Pembroke shot to his feet. Objection. The witness is conflating philosophical disagreement with mental incapacity. Judge Caldwell considered. Sustained. Dr. Havelock, restrict your testimony to medical observations. But the damage was done. The gallery had heard what they needed to hear. Margaret had gone mad. Her compassion was proof of insanity. Whitmore called witness after witness. Margaret's cousins testified to her strange behavior, her habit of walking the fields alone with Samuel, of speaking to him as an equal, of refusing to use the whip even when plantation discipline demanded it. House servants, threatened with sale if they didn't cooperate, recounted conversations where Margaret had spoken of Samuel with inappropriate warmth. Each testimony was a nail in a coffin, being built not just for Samuel, but for the very idea that a white woman could see a black man as anything other than property. When it was Pembroke's turn to present a defense, he looked like a man drowning in open water. Your Honor, he began weakly, Margaret Langdon's will is legally sound. It was witnessed, signed, and filed according to every statute. Her reasons for her bequest may be unconventional, but they are not unlawful. Unconventional? Thaddeus Langdon shouted from the gallery. It's an abomination! Judge Caldwell banged his gavel. Order, Mr. Langdon, one more outburst and you will be removed. Pembroke called his own witnesses. Overseers who testified that Samuel had managed Rosewood competently, that Margaret had been lucid until her final days, that the plantation had thrived under their joint stewardship. But their words fell flat against the weight of public outrage, and then Pembroke made a desperate move. I call Samuel to the stand. The courtroom erupted. Judge Caldwell banged his gavel repeatedly, struggling to restore order. In South Carolina in 1789, allowing a black man, even a freedman, to testify in a case involving white people was nearly unprecedented. Whitmore was on his feet instantly. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. He is a freedman, Pembroke countered. He has standing before this court. Caldwell's jaw tightened. He was a man who followed the letter of the law, even when he despised where it led him. Technically correct. The witness may take the stand. Samuel rose slowly, the chains at his wrists clinking softly. A bailiff led him to the witness box. He stood tall, his face impassive, but his hands trembled slightly as he placed them on the Bible. "State your name," the clerk said. "Samuel." He paused. "I have no other name." Pembroke approached carefully. "Samuel, how long did you serve at Rosewood Plantation?" "All my life, sir. 32 years. "And when did your relationship with Mrs. Langdon change?" Samuel's eyes flickered toward the gallery, toward the sea of hostile faces. "After the colonel died, she asked for my help managing the estate. I gave it." "Did she ever express affection for you?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Samuel's throat worked. She treated me with respect, sir. She spoke to me as if I were—" He stopped himself. "As if you were what?" Pembroke pressed gently. "As if I were a man." The silence was deafening. Whitmore seized his moment. "Mr. Samuel," he said, his voice dripping with false courtesy, "Mrs. Langdon manumitted you 2 years before her death. Why?" "She said every person deserved freedom." "How convenient!" Whitmore smiled coldly. "And in those 2 years did you continue to work at Rosewood?" "Yes, sir. For wages." Samuel hesitated. "No, sir." "So you remained dependent on her charity, on her favor." Whitmore let the word hang. "Tell me, Samuel, what did you do to earn such favor?" I worked the land." "What did you do personally for Mrs. Langdon?" Whitmore's voice rose. "In her house? In her private chambers?" Pembroke jumped up. "Your Honor, he's implying—" "I'm implying nothing," Whitmore snapped. "I'm asking what services this man provided that would lead a white woman of breeding to leave him her entire fortune." Judge Caldwell's gavel cracked like a rifle shot. "Mr. Whitmore, you will ask direct questions or sit down." But again, the damage was done. The gallery was buzzing, the implications spreading like fever. Samuel stood in the witness box, his dignity stripped, his humanity questioned, and he realized with cold clarity that the truth didn't matter. It had never mattered. He was guilty the moment Margaret had written his name in her will. The trial lasted 3 days. On the evening of the 3rd day, Judge Caldwell delivered his verdict. "This court finds that Margaret Elizabeth Langdon was, in her final months, subject to undue influence and diminished capacity. Her will is hereby declared invalid. The estate of Rosewood Plantation shall pass to her legal heirs as determined by interstate succession." He paused, his gaze falling on Samuel. "As for you, Samuel, you are fortunate that this is a civil matter and not a criminal one. However, your manumission papers will be reviewed by the court. Until such time as their legitimacy is verified, you will remain in custody." Samuel's world tilted. The chains suddenly felt heavier, the walls closer. Pembroke looked stricken, mouthing an apology Samuel couldn't hear over the roar of blood in his ears. They led him out through a side door to avoid the mob, but he could still hear them chanting, celebrating, calling for his blood. In the gallery, 3 women sat in separate rows, careful not to acknowledge each other: Eleanor Ashford, Catherine Beaumont, and Lydia Crane. Each wore black, each carried a Bible, and each had testified, when subpoenaed, that they had barely known Margaret Langdon, that they had noticed her odd behavior, and that they fully supported the court's decision. They had sacrificed their friend to save themselves, and as they left the courthouse and returned to their separate plantations, each carried the weight of that betrayal like a stone in her chest. The night after the verdict, Catherine Beaumont could not sleep. She lay in her bed at Harrow Hill, staring at the canopy above her, listening to the river whisper beyond her windows. The moon was full, casting silver light across the rice paddies, and somewhere in the distance, a night bird called, a sound like mourning. She had betrayed Margaret. She had stood in that courtroom and confirmed what they wanted to hear, that Margaret had been unstable, influenced, led astray. And she had done it to protect herself, to protect Caleb, to protect the fragile world they had built in the shadows of propriety. But now, lying alone in the dark, she wondered if protection bought with betrayal was worth having. A soft knock came at her door. Her heart leaped. "Miss Catherine?" Caleb's voice, barely audible. She shouldn't let him in. Not tonight, not ever again. The trial had made the danger crystal clear. But she rose anyway, crossing the floor in her nightgown, and opened the door. He stood in the hallway, his face drawn with exhaustion and something deeper. Grief, perhaps, or fear. "I shouldn't be here," he said quietly. "No," she agreed. "You shouldn't." Neither of them moved. "They're going to review Samuel's manumission papers," Caleb said finally. "If they declare them invalid, he'll be re-enslaved. Sold, most likely." Catherine's throat tightened. "I know. Miss Catherine." He hesitated. "My papers, the ones you filed 3 years ago. They could do the same to me." She had known this was coming, had lain awake imagining this exact conversation. "They could. Then I should leave. Tonight. Before—" "And go where?" she interrupted, her voice sharper than she intended. "Where would you go, Caleb? North? They'd catch you before you reached Virginia. West? Into territories where a black man alone has no protection?" She stepped closer. "You'd be dead or captured within a month. Better than waiting here to be enslaved again." "Is it?" Her eyes glistened. "Is it really?" They stood in silence, the impossible weight of their situation pressing down like the humid, low-country air. "I can't lose you," Catherine whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. Caleb's composure cracked. "You have to, Miss Catherine. We both knew this couldn't last. Margaret, what happened to her is what happens when what? When we forget our places." Catherine's voice turned bitter. "When we dare to see each other as human? When we commit the unforgivable sin of caring?" "Yes." His voice was raw. "Exactly that." Catherine turned away, her hands gripping the doorframe. "I testified against her, against Margaret. I told them she was mad, that she'd been manipulated. I looked into Samuel's eyes across that courtroom and I lied to save myself. You did what you had to do, did I?" She spun back to face him. "Or did I do what was easiest? What was safest? We all did, Eleanor, Lydia and I. We threw Margaret to the wolves and told ourselves it was survival." Caleb said nothing. What could he say? The truth was too heavy for words. "I want you to leave," Catherine said finally, her voice hollow. "Not Charleston, not Harrow Hill, just this house. The main house. Sleep in the quarters, work the fields, and we pretend this never happened. We pretend we're what Charleston expects us to be, mistress and servant, nothing more." "Catherine!" "Miss Beaumont," she corrected sharply. He flinched. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Yes, ma'am." He turned to leave, and Catherine nearly called him back. Nearly reached for him, nearly pulled him into the room and damned the consequences. But fear is a powerful thing, and shame even more so. The door closed softly. Catherine sank to the floor, her back against the wall, and wept for Margaret, for Samuel, for Caleb, and for herself. At Belmead Plantation, Eleanor Ashford faced a different crisis. Her daughter Abigail had returned from Charleston 2 weeks prior, having spent the summer with her aunt in the city. Abigail was 19, beautiful in the sharp-edged way of her mother, and filled with the righteous certainty of youth. She had attended the trial, had listened to every word, and had watched her mother testify. Now, in the drawing room after supper, she confronted Eleanor with eyes like steel. "You lied," Abigail said flatly. Eleanor set down her teacup with careful precision. "I testified truthfully about Margaret's state of mind. You barely knew Margaret Langdon. You said so under oath." Abigail's voice rose. "But I've seen the letters, Mother. I found them in your study before you burned them. You were friends, close friends." Eleanor's blood ran cold. "You went through my private papers. I went through the ashes in your fireplace and found fragments you missed." Abigail pulled a charred scrap of paper from her pocket. "Enough to read Margaret's handwriting. Enough to know you betrayed her." Eleanor stood, her chair scraping back. You understand nothing about what was at stake. I understand you let an innocent man be destroyed to protect yourself. To protect you. Eleanor's composure shattered. To protect this plantation, our name, your future. Do you think I wanted to testify against her? Do you think it didn't sicken me to stand in that courtroom? And she stopped herself, breathing hard. Abigail stared at her mother, seeing something she had never seen before. Fear. What did Margaret do that was so terrible? Abigail asked quietly. She freed a man and left him her property. If her husband had freed him and left him a small bequest, no one would have blinked. But because she was a woman, because she showed compassion, they called it madness. It wasn't just compassion, Eleanor said wearily. It was more than that. Love, affection, connection. Call it what you will. Eleanor moved to the window, looking out at her fields. And yes, the world would destroy her for it. Just as it would destroy me if anyone knew. She stopped again. Abigail's eyes widened. Mother! Eleanor turned, her face a mask of exhaustion. Isaiah has been my foreman for 12 years. He saved this plantation when your father died. He taught me everything I know about managing this estate, and she trailed off. You care for him, Abigail said, not quite believing it. I rely on him. I trust him. I value his counsel. Eleanor's voice was careful, each word measured. Is that love? I don't know, but I know that if Charleston suspected even a fraction of what they accused Margaret of, we would lose everything. You would lose everything. Abigail sat down slowly, the weight of her mother's confession settling over her. So you sacrificed Margaret to save yourself? Yes. Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. And I would do it again. The room fell silent. Outside, the sun was setting over the low country, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. 20 miles north, at Willowmere Plantation, Lydia Crane received an unexpected visitor. Attorney Pembroke arrived as dusk fell, his carriage clattering up the drive unannounced. Lydia met him in the parlour, surprised and wary. Mr. Pembroke, this is unexpected. He looked haggard, his clothes rumpled, his eyes red-rimmed. Mrs. Crane, forgive the intrusion. I need your help. Lydia gestured to a chair, keeping her distance. I'm not sure what help I could provide. Samuel is being held in the Charleston jail. They're reviewing his manumission papers, looking for any technicality to declare them invalid. Pembroke pulled off his spectacles, rubbing his eyes. If they succeed, he'll be sold at auction within a fortnight. That's unfortunate, Lydia said carefully, but I fail to see— You were Margaret's friend, Pembroke interrupted. Don't insult me by pretending otherwise. I drew up her will. I knew about your meetings, your correspondence. Lydia's spine stiffened. Mr. Pembroke, if you're here to threaten, I'm here to beg. He looked up at her, and she saw genuine desperation in his eyes. Margaret trusted you. All of you, and you abandoned her in that courtroom. You let them paint her as mad, as manipulated. You could have stood with her, defended her character, and you chose silence. We chose survival, Lydia said coldly, as would anyone with sense. And what will you do when they come for you next? Pembroke stood, his voice rising. What will you do when they start investigating every widow who dared to rely on her servants, who treated them with a shred of decency? Margaret was the first, Mrs. Crane. She won't be the last. Lydia felt ice in her veins. What are you suggesting? Help me get Samuel out of Charleston. Help me get him north to Philadelphia or New York, where his freedom papers might actually be recognized. That's illegal. So was what Margaret did, Pembroke said quietly. By the standards of this society, showing compassion to a black man is illegal. Recognizing his humanity is illegal, and you know it. Lydia turned away, her mind racing. She thought of Josiah, her own foreman, and the quiet companionship they shared. She thought of Margaret, lying in her grave, her reputation destroyed. She thought of the choice ahead, complicity in Samuel's imprisonment or complicity in his escape. Both were betrayals. The question was, which betrayal could she live with? I can't help you, she said finally. I'm sorry, but I can't. Pembroke nodded slowly, as if he'd expected nothing else. Then God help us all, Mrs. Crane. Because the South we're building here, the one where mercy is madness and compassion is crime, that's a South that will burn. He left without another word. Lydia stood alone in her parlour as night fell, wondering if he was right. 3 weeks after the trial, Catherine Beaumont's world came apart. It started with a letter, not from Charleston, not from the courts, but from a neighbouring planter, Jacob Thornhill of Moss Creek Plantation. The letter was brief, formal, and devastating. Mrs. Beaumont, it has come to my attention through reliable sources that improprieties may exist between yourself and certain members of your household staff. While I take no pleasure in bringing such matters to light, Christian duty compels me to inform you that several parties have expressed concern regarding your reputation and the management of Harrow Hill. I strongly advise you to address these concerns promptly and decisively, lest further action become necessary. Your servant, Jacob Thornhill Catherine, read the letter 3 times, her hands shaking harder with each pass. The language was careful, coded, but the message was clear. Someone had been watching, someone had been talking, and the walls were closing in. She sent for Caleb immediately. He came to the main house at midday, entering through the back door as he had been doing for the past 3 weeks, maintaining the appearance of proper distance. But Catherine could see the strain on his face, the way he held himself with rigid control. "They know," she said without preamble, handing him the letter. Caleb read it slowly, his jaw tightened. "Thornhill is fishing. He has no proof." "He doesn't need proof," Catherine said, her voice rising. "Suspicion is enough. After Margaret, after the trial, even a whisper of impropriety will destroy me." "Then what do you want me to do?" Caleb asked quietly. Catherine paced the room, her mind spinning. "You have to leave. Tonight. I'll give you money, provisions, and a letter of transit. A letter of transit signed by you will be worthless if they're already watching," Caleb interrupted, "and running will look like guilt. Staying will be death." Catherine grabbed his arm, desperation cracking through her composure. "Don't you understand? They will find a way to take you from me. They'll declare your manumission invalid, or they'll accuse you of theft, or they'll simply kill you and call it justice. I can't," her voice broke, "I can't watch them destroy you the way they destroyed Samuel." Caleb covered her hand with his. "Then come with me." Catherine froze. "What?" "Come with me," he repeated, his voice steady now. "We leave together, tonight. We head north, change our names, start over where no one knows us." "That's insane," Catherine breathed. "I'm a white woman of property. If I flee with you, I'll be hunted. My assets will be seized, my reputation annihilated." "Your reputation is already being annihilated," Caleb said. "The only question is whether you'll be here to watch it happen." Catherine pulled away, her mind reeling. The idea was impossible, absurd, suicidal. And yet, as she looked at Caleb, at the man who had saved her plantation, who had taught her to see the world with new eyes, who had shown her that compassion wasn't weakness, she wondered if impossibility was just another word for courage. "I need time to think," she whispered. "We don't have time." Caleb's voice was urgent now. "If Thornhill sent that letter, others will follow. You have days, Catherine, maybe hours." Before she could respond, a commotion erupted outside. Shouts, horses, the sound of boots on gravel. Catherine rushed to the window and felt her blood turn to ice. 6 riders approached the main house, Jacob Thornhill himself, flanked by the county constable and 4 armed men. "They're here," Caleb said flatly. Catherine's mind raced. "The cellar! There's a root cellar beneath the kitchen. Hide there until they leave." "Catherine, go!" She pushed him toward the back hallway. "I'll handle this." Caleb hesitated for one more heartbeat, his eyes searching hers. Then he disappeared into the house's shadows. Catherine straightened her dress, smoothed her hair, and walked out onto the veranda with her head held high. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her fear. Jacob Thornhill dismounted, his face grim. He was a broad man, with a thick beard and eyes like dirty ice. "Mrs. Beaumont, forgive the intrusion." "Mr. Thornhill," Catherine said coolly, "to what do I owe this visit?" The constable stepped forward, a wiry man named Garrett, whom Catherine had met at social functions. "Mrs. Beaumont, we've received reports of illegal activity on your property." "What sort of activity?" "Harboring a fugitive," Thornhill said bluntly. "A freedman named Caleb, whose manumission papers have been called into question." Catherine's heart hammered, but her face remained impassive. "Caleb works for me as a foreman. His papers are in order." "Are they?" Thornhill pulled a document from his coat. "This is a petition filed with the Charleston court, claiming that Caleb's manumission was granted under false pretenses. Until the matter is resolved, he is to be remanded to custody." "On what grounds?" Catherine demanded. "On the grounds that a woman operating alone cannot be trusted to maintain proper authority over her slaves," Thornhill said, his voice dripping with condescension. "And on the grounds that you, Mrs. Beaumont, have been accused of unnatural attachments." The words hung in the air like poison. Catherine felt the world tilt. "Who accused me?" "Multiple sources. Your own house staff. Concerned neighbors." Thornhill's smile was thin and cruel. "The details don't matter. What matters is that Caleb must come with us. Now. And if I refuse?" Constable Garrett shifted uncomfortably. "Mrs. Beaumont, please don't make this more difficult. We have legal authority to terrorize a widow on her own property." Catherine's voice rose. "To seize a free man based on rumors and spite. To maintain order," Thornhill said coldly. "Now, where is he?" Catherine looked at the 6 men arrayed before her, at their guns and their certainty, and she made a choice. "I don't know," she lied. Thornhill's eyes narrowed. "Search the house," he ordered his men. They swept through Harrow Hill like a plague, overturning furniture, ransacking rooms, tearing through the quarters. Catherine stood on the veranda, her fists clenched, watching her home be violated. They found the root cellar within 10 minutes. Caleb was dragged out into the yard, his hands bound, his face expressionless. He didn't look at Catherine. He didn't have to. They both knew this was the end. "Caleb," Thornhill said, his voice falsely pleasant, "you're going to come with us to Charleston. We have some questions about your papers." "My papers are legitimate," Caleb said quietly. "Then you have nothing to worry about." Thornhill turned to Catherine. "Mrs. Beaumont, I strongly suggest you reconsider your associations for your own sake." They loaded Caleb onto a horse and rode away. Catherine watched until they disappeared down the long drive, until the dust settled, until the only sound was the whisper of the river and her own ragged breathing. Then she walked into her house, locked herself in her study, and began to write. Letters to attorneys, letters to sympathetic contacts in Charleston, letters calling in every favor, every debt, every scrap of influence she possessed. She would not abandon Caleb the way they had abandoned Margaret, even if it destroyed her. When Eleanor Ashford heard about Caleb's arrest, she knew the reckoning had come. She called Isaiah to the main house that evening, closing the door to her study behind them. He stood before her desk, his face carefully neutral, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "You've heard," she said. "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor sat down heavily. "They arrested Caleb on suspicion of irregular relations with Catherine Beaumont. They're reviewing his manumission papers. He'll likely be re-enslaved and sold." Isaiah said nothing. "Isaiah," Eleanor continued, her voice tight, "your manumission papers were filed in 1783, 7 years ago. But if they start investigating, if they decide to scrutinize every freedman working for a widow, they'll come for me next," Isaiah finished quietly. Eleanor nodded. "I think you should leave. Tonight. I'll give you money, a horse, letters of introduction to contacts in Philadelphia." "No." Eleanor looked up, startled. "What?" "I won't run, Mrs. Ashford." Isaiah's voice was calm but firm. "If I run, it confirms their suspicions. It ruins you, and I won't do that. If you stay, They'll arrest you, Eleanor said desperately. They'll take you, and I won't be able to stop them. Then that's what happens. Isaiah met her eyes. I've been free for 7 years. I've managed this plantation, raised your daughter alongside you, lived as a man instead of property. If they take that from me, at least I'll know I had it, and I won't destroy you to keep it. Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes, something she hadn't allowed herself in years. Isaiah, I can't lose you. You won't lose me, ma'am. Whatever they do, whatever papers they revoke, they can't take away what we built here. They can't unmake the work, the conversations, He paused. The respect. Eleanor stood and crossed to the window, unable to look at him. Margaret showed mercy, and they buried her. Catherine showed love, and they're destroying her. What hope do we have? Maybe none, Isaiah admitted. But hiding and running isn't hope either. It's just fear with a different name. Eleanor turned back to him, and for the first time in their 12 years together, she let him see her completely, not as mistress, not as employer, but as a woman terrified of losing the one person who truly understood her. I testified against Margaret to protect you, she said quietly. I betrayed my friend, and I did it so they wouldn't look at us, so they wouldn't see what we... She stopped. Was I wrong? Isaiah considered the question for a long moment. I don't know, Mrs. Ashford, but I know that guilt is eating you alive, and I know that guilt won't save either of us if they decide to come. He was right. Eleanor knew he was right, but knowing didn't make the weight any lighter. Stay in the quarters tonight, she said finally. Keep your papers close. If anyone comes asking questions, send for me immediately. Yes, ma'am. He turned to leave, but Eleanor called him back. Isaiah? He stopped, waiting. Thank you, she said softly, for everything. He nodded once, then disappeared into the night. Eleanor stood alone in her study, surrounded by ledgers and accounts and all the trappings of power, and realized that power meant nothing when mercy was a crime. At Willowmere, Lydia Crane made her decision. She had spent 3 weeks wrestling with Pembroke's plea, 3 weeks watching the noose tighten around Catherine and Caleb, 3 weeks living with the knowledge that she had chosen safety over honor. Now, sitting in her parlor with a bottle of brandy and her conscience, she admitted the truth. Safety was an illusion. The South they lived in didn't offer protection to women like her, women who dared to see their slaves as human. It only offered the choice between complicity and destruction. She called for Josiah. He came to the main house, as he had countless times before, and sat across from her in the parlor. He was 60 years old, his hair white as cotton, his hands gnarled from a lifetime of labor, but his eyes were sharp, and he watched her with quiet understanding. They arrested Caleb, Lydia said without preamble. They'll come for Isaiah next, and eventually they'll come for you. I know, Josiah said simply. Your papers are legitimate. I filed them myself 10 years ago. Lydia leaned forward. But legitimacy doesn't matter anymore. After Margaret, after the trial, suspicion is enough. So what do you propose, ma'am? Lydia poured herself another brandy, her hand steady. I propose we burn it all down. Josiah raised an eyebrow. Ma'am? Not literally, Lydia clarified. But I'm done hiding. I'm done pretending. I'm going to Charleston tomorrow, and I'm going to testify on Caleb's behalf. I'm going to tell the court that Margaret Langdon was the sanest woman I ever knew, and that treating a man with decency is not a crime. They'll destroy you, Josiah said quietly. They're destroying me anyway, slowly through fear and silence. Lydia met his gaze. I'm 73 years old, Josiah. I have no children, no heirs, and no future beyond these walls. If I'm going to fall, I'd rather fall standing. Josiah was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, he smiled, a rare, genuine smile that transformed his weathered face. Then I'll stand with you, Mrs. Crane. You don't have to... I know, he interrupted gently, but I will. They sat together in the lamplight, two people on opposite sides of an unbridgeable divide, preparing to jump anyway. Tomorrow, They would go to Charleston. Tomorrow, the real battle would begin. The Charleston courthouse was even more crowded for Caleb's hearing than it had been for Samuel's trial. Word had spread through the Low Country like wildfire. Another freedman, another widow, another test of the social order. The gallery was packed with planters eager to see justice, which meant punishment, served. Catherine Beaumont sat in the front row, dressed in stark black, her face pale but composed. Beside her, to everyone's shock, sat Eleanor Ashford and Lydia Crane. The three widows, together for the first time since Margaret's death, presenting a united front that sent ripples of whispers through the crowd. Judge Caldwell presided again, his face carved from the same granite as before. But this time, something was different. Attorney Pembroke had been joined by two additional lawyers from Philadelphia, abolitionists who had traveled south specifically for this case. And more importantly, the courthouse steps outside were lined with freed blacks from Charleston, silent witnesses demanding to be seen. The prosecution, led again by Silas Whitmore, opened with familiar arguments. Caleb's manumission papers were suspect, obtained through undue influence, granted by a woman incapable of making sound judgments about her property. But when Pembroke stood to present his defense, he did something unexpected. "Your Honor," he began, his voice stronger than it had been at Samuel's trial, "I call Mrs. Lydia Crane to the stand." The courtroom erupted. Whitmore shot to his feet. "Objection! Mrs. Crane has no standing in this case." Mrs. Crane was a close friend of both Margaret Langdon and Catherine Beaumont, Pembroke countered. She has direct knowledge of the circumstances surrounding these manumissions and the character of the women involved. Judge Caldwell considered, his expression unreadable. "I'll allow it, but keep it relevant, Mr. Pembroke." Lydia took the stand, her spine straight, her hands folded calmly in her lap. At 73, she had the bearing of a woman who had survived too much to fear a courtroom. "Mrs. Crane," Pembroke began, "you testified at Margaret Langdon's trial that you barely knew her. Was that testimony truthful?" The gallery gasped. Whitmore looked like he'd been struck. Lydia met Pembroke's gaze steadily. "No, sir, it was not." "Why did you lie?" "Because I was afraid." Her voice rang clear through the chamber. "I was afraid of what they would do to me if I told the truth, afraid of losing my property, my reputation, my freedom, so I betrayed my friend to save myself." "And what is the truth, Mrs. Crane?" Lydia turned to face the gallery, her eyes sweeping across the sea of hostile faces. "The truth is that Margaret Langdon was one of the most intelligent, capable, and compassionate women I have ever known. She managed a 1,000-acre plantation better than most men. She treated her workers with dignity because she recognized their humanity. And when she freed Samuel and left him her estate, she did so with perfect clarity of mind and purpose." The courtroom exploded. Judge Caldwell's gavel cracked repeatedly. "Order, order in this court!" Pembroke pressed forward. "Mrs. Crane, are you saying that manumitting slaves and treating them with respect is a sign of sound judgment?" "I'm saying that recognizing a man's humanity is not insanity," Lydia said firmly. "I'm saying that this court, this society, has convinced itself that compassion is corruption and mercy is madness, and I'm saying that I will not participate in that delusion any longer." She looked directly at Judge Caldwell. "Margaret Langdon died of fever, but we killed her reputation, her legacy, and her final wishes because she dared to see a black man as worthy of inheritance. And now you're prepared to do the same to Catherine Beaumont, to Caleb, and to anyone else who steps outside the narrow boundaries of what this society considers acceptable." Whitmore was on his feet. "Your Honor, this is a political speech, not testimony." "This is the truth," Lydia interrupted, her voice rising. "And if you convict Caleb, if you revoke his freedom based on nothing but suspicion and prejudice, then every freedman in South Carolina will know that their papers mean nothing, that their freedom exists only at the pleasure of white fear." She turned back to the gallery. "I am a widow. I have relied on my foreman, Josiah, for 10 years. He has managed my plantation, advised me on matters of business and agriculture, and been a trusted counselor. Have I been corrupted? Have I been manipulated?" She paused. "Or have I simply recognized the value of a good man's counsel, regardless of the color of his skin?" The silence that followed was deafening. Pembroke let it hang for a moment, then said quietly, "No further questions." Whitmore approached for cross-examination, but for once he seemed uncertain. "Mrs. Crane, are you saying you have inappropriate relations with your foreman?" "Define inappropriate," Lydia said coolly. "I speak with him daily. I value his opinion. I treat him with respect. If that is inappropriate, then yes, I am guilty. But I refuse to call basic human decency a crime." Whitmore tried several more angles, but Lydia was immovable. When she finally stepped down, Catherine Beaumont stood and took her place. Catherine's testimony was more emotional, but no less powerful. She spoke of how Caleb had saved Harrow Hill from collapse, how he had taught her about rice cultivation and plantation management, how he had never once overstepped his position or demanded anything beyond fair treatment. "They say I was manipulated," Catherine said, her voice shaking but clear. "They say I couldn't possibly have made sound judgments about my own property. But the truth is, I saw Caleb's intelligence, his skill, his humanity. And when I freed him, I did so because slavery is wrong, not because I was confused or corrupted, but because I finally saw clearly." She looked at the judges. "If recognizing that makes me mad, then I am proudly insane. But I think the madness lies with those who insist that compassion is a crime." When Eleanor Ashford took the stand, even Judge Caldwell seemed surprised. Eleanor was known as one of the most practical, hard-headed planters in the Low Country. Her testimony carried weight. "I betrayed Margaret," Eleanor said bluntly. "I stood in this courtroom and confirmed the prosecution's narrative because I was afraid. Afraid for my daughter, my plantation, my position. But I've spent every day since living with that cowardice, and I'm done." She gestured to Isaiah, sitting in the gallery. "That man has been my foreman for 12 years. He has taught me everything I know about running Belmead. He has been advisor, counselor, and friend. And if this court declares that such relationships are illegal, then you might as well arrest half the widows in South Carolina." Whitmore objected strenuously, but Eleanor wasn't finished. "Margaret Langdon's will wasn't madness," she concluded. "It was the clearest act of sanity in a society built on delusion. We tell ourselves that some people are property, that humanity can be bought and sold, that compassion toward our slaves means weakness. But the only madness here is the system that requires such lies to function." By the time the three widows had finished testifying, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. Not everyone was convinced. The planters in the gallery still muttered about blasphemy and corruption, but doubt had been planted. Then Pembroke called his final witness, Caleb himself. Caleb took the stand with quiet dignity. Pembroke asked him about his work at Harrow Hill, his relationship with Catherine, and his manumission. "Did you manipulate Mrs. Beaumont?" Pembroke asked directly. "No, sir," Caleb said firmly. "I did my job. I advised her on matters of agriculture and management. I treated her with respect, and she treated me with the same. When she freed me, I was grateful. But I never asked for it, never demanded it, never used influence beyond my competence." "Do you love Mrs. Beaumont?" The question was bold, dangerous. Caleb paused, considering. The entire courtroom held its breath. "I respect her," he said finally. "I admire her courage, her intelligence, her compassion. Do I care for her? Yes. But caring for someone isn't a crime, Mr. Pembroke. And recognizing the humanity in another person shouldn't be either." Whitmore's cross-examination was vicious, but Caleb remained steady. He refused to be provoked, refused to give them the ammunition they needed. When both sides rested, Judge Caldwell called a recess. He returned 2 hours later, his face grave. This court, he began slowly, has heard compelling testimony from multiple witnesses. The matter before us is not simply whether Caleb's manumission papers are valid. They are by the letter of the law. The question is whether we, as a society, will allow such manumissions to stand when they challenge our social order. He paused, his gaze sweeping the courtroom. I am not a young man. I have sat on this bench for 30 years, and I have sentenced men to hang for crimes far less serious than showing compassion. I have upheld laws I did not agree with because I believed in the stability of our system. Another pause. Catherine gripped the edge of her seat. But I cannot, in good conscience, declare Caleb's freedom invalid when it was granted legally and maintained properly. His manumission papers are sound. He is, and shall remain, a free man. The courtroom exploded. Half in outrage, half in shocked relief. Whitmore looked apoplectic. The planters in the gallery shouted protests, but Judge Caldwell's gavel came down like thunder. However, he continued, and the room fell silent again, I cannot ignore the concerns raised about impropriety. Mrs. Beaumont, I strongly advise you to reconsider your household arrangements. The appearance of impropriety can be as damaging as the act itself. It was a compromise, a half-victory that saved Caleb but warned Catherine to maintain distance, not justice, but survival. As the courtroom cleared, Catherine met Caleb's eyes across the room. They said nothing. They didn't need to. The message was clear. We won this battle, but the war isn't over. 3 months later, Catherine Beaumont sold Harrow Hill. It wasn't a decision she made lightly. But after the trial, after the scrutiny and the whispers and the constant surveillance from her neighbors, she realized that staying in South Carolina meant living in a cage. So she sold the plantation to a cousin, liquidated her assets, and disappeared. Rumors said she went north. Some claimed they'd seen her in Philadelphia, others in New York. A few swore they'd spotted her in a small Massachusetts town, running a modest farm with a dark-skinned man who claimed to be her foreman. But no one could prove anything. Catherine Beaumont had simply vanished, like morning mist over the Low Country. Eleanor Ashford kept Belmead, but she changed the way she ran it. She began gradually manumitting her slaves, paying wages to those who stayed, and transforming her plantation into one of the first paid labor estates in South Carolina. It was controversial, inefficient by the standards of the time, and it cost her social standing. But Isaiah remained her foreman, and Abigail grew into a woman who understood that mercy was not weakness. Lydia Crane died peacefully in her sleep 2 years after the trial. She was 75 years old, and her will, prepared carefully by Attorney Pembroke, left Willowmere Plantation to Josiah. The family challenged it, of course, but this time the court upheld it. The precedent had been set. The cracks in the system had begun to show. And Samuel? Samuel was never re-enslaved. After Caleb's trial, the scrutiny on his case intensified. Pembroke, backed by the abolitionist lawyers, mounted a fierce legal defense. It took 8 months, but eventually the court confirmed his freedom. The Langdon cousins were furious, but there was little they could do. Samuel did not return to Rosewood. The plantation was sold, the fields parceled out, the workers scattered. Instead, he traveled north with Pembroke's help, settling in Pennsylvania and working as a carpenter. He never spoke publicly about Margaret, about what they had shared or what it had meant. But in 1802, 13 years after Margaret's death, a small book was published in Philadelphia, Recollections of a Freedman. It was written anonymously, but those who knew Samuel recognized his voice in its pages. One passage near the end read, "She saw me when others looked through me. She spoke to me when others commanded me. She gave me not just freedom, but the possibility of dignity." They called her mad for it. They destroyed her reputation, denied her legacy, and tried to erase her name from history. But I remember. And as long as I live, I will carry the truth, that mercy is not madness, and compassion is not crime. The world that punished her is the world that needs to change.